All right, buckle up. This is going to be a big one. So, you may have heard, or maybe not, that there have been, in a very short time frame, 2 sawmill closures in western Montana. And they cited as a reason for their closure an inability to attract labor. The homes in the area were just too expensive and they couldn't pay enough to attract people to actually come and work at the sawmill. So they couldn't turn out enough product to actually keep themselves viable. This outcome is a surprise to absolutely nobody who's familiar with the forest industry. This has been a problem brewing for quite some time. And the drop in the labor force brought about by the pandemic and the subsequent rise in costs everywhere has precipitated this outcome probably a little bit earlier than it otherwise would have precipitated, but it still would have. So partly because of my involvement in the forest industry, but also just because of my broader interests, the question of labor shortages and demography has been a huge interest of mine. So I'm actually in Mexico right now, and it's kind of strange for a lot of people. Mexico gets some bad press in the United States, and so people ask me often, what's wrong with me? Why would I come here? I'm gonna get kidnapped, killed, etc. And there's a lot of reasons why I come down here. This is actually my second winter. Firstly, I don't like the snow. I don't like the winter. I'm fortunate enough to be able to come down here. There's great beaches, great landscapes, great forests, great food, great people. The list just goes on. There's also scorpions, and I find scorpions to be pretty cool. But I'm also absolutely fascinated by Mexico. I'm fascinated by the economy. I'm fascinated by the demographics and dynamics. It's, in many ways, the past, present, and future of the United States economy, directly and indirectly. So I really enjoy coming down here and kind of observing different dynamics, comparing and contrasting. So sit back and allow me to explain what I mean. Now, fair warning, if you've been watching my videos, you may have been able to tell by now that I have a tendency of adding what seems like too much information. And to me, it's very relevant information. And so I might kind of get off track and you're going to think to yourself, what does this have to do with forestry? I promise you I'm going to circle back. The reason I'm giving so much detail is because this is going to be the issue in forestry for the rest of your life. So I highly recommend that you watch through this video. But I will preface this by saying that this is not an alarmist or overly negative video. I actually think there's a lot to look forward to here. But it's going to be difficult and there's going to be some pain. But we are in a transitionary period and I think we're going to make it out all right. So just bottom line up front, let's get started. So to get started, let's talk about the basics of demography and let's look at a population pyramid. Now, I'm sure you've all seen this or seen something like it. This is actually the population of Uganda, still very much a developing nation. And the shape of this pyramid is probably what humans are used to from a historical standpoint. This is what a population pyramid looked like throughout the majority of human history in a majority of places. And there's a very dark side to it. So, of course, we have the most numerous cohort is going to be the youngest. And you have a high infant mortality rate. And then after that, you have a fairly constant trickle of death that follows a single cohort until none remain. Obviously not ideal. So fortunately, with advancements in medicine, we've been able to reduce infant mortality, we've been able to increase the lifespan of the elderly, and we've also been able to decrease some of that death throughout life from things like infections, accidents, and we've also done things like improve workplace safety, which historically was a pretty large portion of mortality, especially for men. So over time, what a lot of economies developed is something that looked like this. And this is actually the current demographic pyramid of Mexico. So you have those advancements in life expectancy, you have the advancements in reducing infant mortality, but there's still a fairly high birth rate. The birth rate's tapered off considerably, but you're still around replacement levels, so your population's fairly stable. So that's important to remember, is the birth rate is decreasing, but currently, from just looking at this pyramid, things are very stable. Something like this is probably ideal, but it never stays this way. They usually end up looking something like this. This is the current demographic pyramid of the United States. This is Germany. This is Italy. And this is South Korea. And just for good measure, this is China, and this is Japan. Bottom line is the birth rate declines dramatically. You have a lot of older people and not a whole lot of young people. So what's the problem with this? Well, in a very real way, this has made us poor. Younger people are the ones that tend to do the jobs that are most labor intensive, at the very least. So when I'm in the United States, and keep in mind, I live rural, as most of you do too. So we're talking about the average demographics of the United States, and then in rural areas, it's more pronounced. So when I'm in the United States and my car breaks down, I can be stuck without a car for 2 weeks because that's how long it takes a mechanic to get my car in. And that's assuming he doesn't need to order a part. If I want carpentry work done on my house, I have to hire a carpenter a year in advance, and I'm not exaggerating about that. And even if I go to McDonald's, it might take 30 minutes for them to get my order wrong. And don't even get me started on anything that involves medical treatment. We all know how that is. So in Mexico, which I won't call a poor country, but objectively has a significantly lower GDP per capita figure, if that means anything at all, and I'm not convinced it does, the situation is totally different. I still am in disbelief, to be perfectly honest. So earlier this year, there were some stray puppies born outside of my apartment, and my girlfriend and I actually got a mobile vet to come and spay and neuter them all free of charge. And when we needed to, take them to appointments, we only had to walk a few blocks to take them to another vet who very graciously did not charge us for that. Just the other day, in less wholesome dog news, my neighbor's intellectually challenged pit bull mistook my ankle for a T-bone steak. And I went to the hospital, again, just a few blocks down, and they patched me all up and gave me some antibiotics and such for $15 USD. And just to prove that there's more going on in my life than just dogs, my friend's motorcycle is held together with spit and prayers, and so it breaks down about every 3 hours of operation. And he can survive like that because wherever he breaks down, he's always within a couple blocks of either a parts store or a mechanic. So in the United States, as a rural man, I basically have to do everything myself in order to survive. I can't rely on external services. And that's part of the reason why I actually ride my motorcycle everywhere these days, is if something happens, it's easy to fix, and I can fix it myself. Whereas in Mexico, Mexicans actually, they can't understand my stubbornness in doing things myself. If I even have to change my oil on my motorcycle, my neighbors are like, there's a mechanic, just go over there, there's a mechanic. Like, why are you doing that? Or I had the flu a few months back, and all my friends were like, well, go to the doctors. I'm like, why would I go to the doctors for a flu? Like, no way. But that's just how they do it here because they can. They're very rich in services, and they don't cost much. And so the standard of living in many ways is higher because of the demographics. There's a lot more young people. There's a lot of doctors, a lot of optometrists, a lot of veterinarians. They're all here, so you might as well use them. It's very fascinating. So this is the present reality in both countries. The demographic situation has already had a very identifiable impact on our absolute wealth or our standard of living, however you want to phrase it. There's a very real impact to how things actually get done. This is happening, and the mill closures are proof of this. But the other reality is that in both countries, despite the current condition being different, the trajectory is actually the absolute same. The birth rate in Mexico is also declining in line with patterns of a developing country. The other thing that's happening along with the declining birth rate is rising wages. So let's look at one other country that's important in the story real quick, and that's China. We've already seen their demographic pyramid. So their birth rate now is extremely low. It's lower than it was during the one-child policy in the 70s, which I don't even understand how that's possible, but it's true. So when people cite the one-child policy for the reason why China's demographics are a bit messed up, that's not totally accurate. It's a long-term thing. And as we also know, over the last 2 decades, China's economy has grown rapidly. It's been one of the fastest growing economies of the world, and In absolute terms, it's larger than the United States at this point, though not per capita. So what happens when you have a stagnant or declining population with rapid economic growth? That's right, you get rising wages. And so this is a graph of Chinese wages over the past few decades. Crazy, right? I bet you wish your paycheck looked like that. So, one of the big issues we've been talking about in the United States for the past few decades has been offshoring. All these countries are going to China to build factories because the labor is just so cheap. It ain't anymore. That's huge. That's a huge shift that nobody's really talking about. And so what's actually happening is a lot of these countries are reshoring their facilities, not to the United States necessarily. Some are, but not necessarily. But in a very large part, they are building those factories in Mexico, northern Mexico to be specific. And so I rode down here in a motorcycle. I've been all over Mexico at this point, except for the Baja Peninsula and the Yucatan actually. But I went through San Luis Potosi, Nuevo Leon, Tamaulipas, etc. And in kind of like the Saltillo region, Nuevo Leon, etc. It's crazy. It's absolutely mind-blowing, these factories that are being built. You'll be out in the desert in the middle of nowhere, and then you'll just see this giant, Leviathan looking, I don't know, it looks like something out of science fiction, like a colony on Mars or something. And then you have these railroads going right through the desert with just, double stacked shipping containers. It's really unbelievable. It's crazy. And going through Monterey, it reminds me of Dubai. It's crazy. You have these giant skyscrapers that are just made of glass and look very modern. And of course, it's out there in the desert. It reminds me of Dubai. And when I stayed in Saltillo, there are these areas with sidewalks that were made of polished granite and these very obviously well-to-do young couples. There's a lot of wealth in northern Mexico that's being created right now. And no, I know what you're thinking. It's not that. It's actual business. And this will just continue. Even Tesla is building a factory in Mexico right now, which is, everyone's talking about it, but Tesla's only part of the picture. There's a lot more coming. But remember, Mexico's birth rate is also declining. So for the first time, you're starting to have a diminishing surplus, at the very least, of workers. And so Mexican wages are starting to look like this. So why is this important? Immigration. So first off, I do not want to start a debate about whether immigration is good or bad. That is far beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today. I want to be as objective as possible with this discussion. And so here are my base assumptions. My first assumption is without immigration, at best right now, the United States would have a plateaued population and a declining workforce. And in reality, probably we'd have a declining population right now. My second assumption is that immigration increases the population and the workforce. That we can all agree with. Now, my last two assumptions is that a benefit of a declining workforce is increasing wages. A consequence of a decreasing workforce is an increased scarcity of goods and services. So having said that, let's look into this. So we all know that a huge chunk of immigration to the United States has come from or through Mexico. So actual immigration from Mexico has been trending downward since about 2008. But of course, right now we've been seeing a lot in the news. There's been a surge of migration on the border, and a lot of that is actually coming from Venezuela. So as I've been motorcycling through this country, I've been seeing groups of people in the desert carrying Venezuelan flags, in the mountains, in the jungles. There's been a very large surge in migrant traffic in Mexico. Now, importantly, a lot of them are on their way to the United States, but there's a lot of them that are also staying here and working here. And there's a few reasons for that. Partially because wages are high in relative terms, but also because if you're coming to a new country and you're not going through proper legal channels and you're trying to start a new life, quite frankly, it's just a lot easier to do it here. As we all know, in the United States, to do anything these days, you need a social security card, you need 3 forms of identification. It's pretty absurd. Whereas here, you can just kind of live. I can get off the plane, buy a motorcycle if I'm traveling by plane, and rent an apartment, no identification, no background checks, nothing. I can just live my life. And, even though technically it would be illegal, I can get a job here pretty easily as well. Not necessarily a high-paying job, but I can do it. And so you also have a lot of Argentinians coming here for the same reason, because Argentina is also collapsing again. So while currently, and especially in the past, the United States has been a prime destination for immigration, Mexico is becoming a destination in itself. And yes, of course, there are still plenty of Mexicans coming over to the United States to work legally and illegally, and I've talked to many of them. And almost universally what I found is these guys have had almost mythical conceptions of the United States. They've had very unrealistic expectations. So my friend thought that the minimum wage in the United States was $50 USD. The market I go to and the place where I buy fruit, the guy who works there or owns it, he used to work in Miami, but then came back because the United States was too expensive. And the saddest story I heard, which is more common than you'd think, is I talked to a miner whose mine had filled up with water during a particularly rainy season. And he thought he would go over to the United States to work for a period while his mine cleared out. But he did not go through legal channels. And so he paid the cartel $12,000 USD to go over to the United States to work for a season and come back. There's no way that makes any sense whatsoever. But he is not alone. Now, I'm not saying that opportunities in the United States don't exist for these people. They clearly do, but I think a big draw of the United States is not based on reality. It's kind of this mythology that's been passed down from previous generations. The United States and Mexico and probably the rest of Latin America is seen as kind of the land of wealth and abundance, and it just isn't necessarily like that anymore. And so this perception is changing swiftly, particularly with the younger generation. Generally, I find the most people in Mexico who are extremely friendly to the United States and Americans, they tend to be older. We'll say like over 30, over 40 maybe. But then when I talk to younger generations, there's a lot of antipathy for the United States, for sure. And so even though you might think I'm completely insane for saying this, I really think that an end to mass migration to the United States is baked into the cards. Now, it might take 10 more years to really play itself out, but especially with how fast wages are rising in Mexico and other countries where, quite frankly, there's less border controls, I think it's inevitable. I really do. And so the significance here, again, is that whether you like it or not, regardless of how you feel about immigration, if it weren't for the increases in population coming from people born in other countries, the population would at best be stagnant, and we'd probably be posting our first decline at the latest, maybe 2 years from now. So that leaves us with nothing but birth rates as our savior. And let me tell you, they aren't getting any better, and they're already well below replacement levels. Younger people just aren't having many kids anymore. When they are having kids, it's usually 1, at most 2. But there's a huge swath of people that just aren't having any kids. And it's a complex issue. People like to kind of say it's this or the other thing that's causing it. It's multidimensional. There's many parts to this. There's an economic component. I mean, everyone says, well, it's super expensive to have kids. It's a little deeper than that. In the past, when we were an agrarian society and you had kids, the kids actually made you money. They could work on the farm. The only reason I exist is because my grandfather could pick potatoes when he was a kid. These days, when you have a kid, you actually have to, pay for that. Another component of this is increasing education levels. Generally, the more educated people are, the less kids they tend to have, for many reasons. Part of it is career orientation. Part of it's the 4 years of college that kind of delays these life choices. And this effect is more pronounced with women who, if you weren't aware, were the ones who actually have kids. There's a cultural component. Younger people just value freedom more, and they see children as an inhibition to that. There's a political component. This is actually an interesting one. There's kind of a bifurcation in political beliefs between men and women. So younger men tend to be more conservative, younger women tend to be more liberal. And this is at a time when our country's politics are so much more divisive. And so there tends to be kind of a political antipathy that's developing between men and women. But that's all academic and, quite frankly, a bit irrelevant, because it's not getting any better. I don't think there's a single nation on earth that's been able to turn these trends around. There's been a lot of countries that have had economic incentives for having kids, tax breaks. I mean, in a certain sense, we have tax breaks in the United States. Doesn't seem to help. And it can go a lot lower from where we are today. So for context, the replacement birth rate is 2.1 births per woman. In the United States right now, it's about 1.64, which doesn't seem too bad, but it's enough to cause some long-term problems. And in South Korea, that number is 0.68. There are 0.68 babies for every couple, for every woman, however you want to word that. And you also have to remember the effect this has like 40 years from now, because when the current generation being born comes to childbearing age, then they're having, even if it stays constant, 0.64 kids per woman. And it declines very rapidly. It can really collapse over a fairly short period of time. And one thing that's very frustrating about that is if you look at current UN population estimates, they all, like universally, they all assume that the birth rate's going to tick up. And so that vastly changes the projections over the next 100 years, but it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. All right, so that's what's going on. Why should forestry people and landowners pay attention to this in particular? Well, first of all, because we have the burden of time. By the very nature of our activity and production, we have to be looking at least 50 years into the future. And it don't look too good. Second, this is inherently a rural industry, and I've been talking about national averages so far. Rural areas are like 30 years ahead of everyone else in terms of birth rates. I mean, we already have parts of the country that look like South Korea. In Aroostook County in Maine, where I'm from, there have been some people moving in since the pandemic a little bit, but it's still a very old county. There's a handful of people my age in each town, let alone younger than me. And again, this will get worse. And I mean, like I said, it's here. It's already happening. This isn't something that happens 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. We're here. It's happening. We've been hearing about it for a while now, but it's happening now. The 2 mills in Montana closed because they couldn't find workers. I've been hearing from a lot of you that you can't find loggers. You can't find even foresters. And that's the same dynamics taking place. And trust me, in the broader forest industry, the large industrial mills, the large landowners, it's no better. I haven't been hearing good things there either. So we have to deal with this. We can't stop this. There's nothing we can do to change trajectory, at least certainly not individually. And we're just going to have to adapt to this new reality. The population decline, even collapse, is coming. Now, maybe you could object to everything I'm saying, and you could say, well, AI is going to come in, and everyone's going to be out of a job. It's going to automate everything. I am highly skeptical of those claims. First of all, I feel like the internet came out and the internet really was revolutionary, and since then we have this bias to overestimate the impact that every subsequent piece of technology has. Self-driving cars, we've been hearing about that for 10 years, and I think it's pretty clear by now that we're not going to see widespread adoption. They've been trying them out in like LA and some of the Silicon Valley towns, and they haven't really been working all that well, and people hate them. Drones. You remember when Amazon was going to have drone delivery? You could get something in a few hours, and that hasn't materialized. Virtual reality. Now, I actually like virtual reality. I think there's a lot of potential there, but there's maybe a handful of games because it's so hard to develop games for it. So it's just kind of this niche thing that's more of a novelty. Same with NFTs and Web3. That was going to change everything, and people were going to be, paying millions of dollars for Big Mac NFTs or whatever the crazy stuff people were saying. But people just have a tendency to overestimate a technology when it's early in its adoption phase. Now, AI is very interesting. Like I don't doubt that. I very much try to find practical applications for it in my own life. Really, the only thing I found that doesn't take more work to make it work is Excel. It's pretty good at finding Excel errors and to make formulas for you so you don't have to think about it. But in terms of writing, I think it sucks and it's getting worse. in terms of video and like photos. It's just stock photos and stock video. Like that's already been around for a while. It's disrupting a very small handful of industries like stock photos and copywriting. We just, I'm very skeptical that that's going to have any real impact on anything at all. And especially when you look at forestry, right? So when you're looking at more concrete automation, factory automation, and tangible production automation, forestry hasn't really seen any real automation since the 90s, since processors came out and the processor heads and they could automatically cut logs to lengths. There's been basically zero automation since then. There have been a handful of technologies that have made things slightly more efficient, so we've reached internal efficiencies. GIS is part of that. Drones have actually done that. I should do a video on that. But we haven't actually seen a whole lot of real automation that would make us less dependent on actual people doing actual work. So bottom line, I just don't see it at all. So this population decline, potentially even collapse if we're looking at rural areas in particular, it's going to be impactful. It will. And there's going to be a lot of pain. I'm not going to pretend like there won't. But I think we're going to be in a transitional phase of essentially economic models. I think the days of heavier rent seeking are essentially over. So if you're a fairly passive landowner that is highly dependent on the labor of other people, I think your margins are going to be eaten away fairly significantly. And that's going to be particularly devastating for larger landowners because their operations depend on fairly intensive labor every step of the way, from harvesting to trucking to road maintenance to the mechanics to keep all those things running, and then of course to the mill side itself. There's a lot of people that are involved in a functional forest economy. They'll survive, but they're going to have to fundamentally rethink their strategy. And I think a core part of that, which is almost inevitable and obvious, is going to be growing their trees to a larger size for a longer period to make the actual harvesting and milling more efficient. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. I would welcome that change, to be perfectly honest. But I think overall, we're heading into an era where the advantage will go to labor. And the owner-operator, the one who owns the machine and operates the machine, will be unstoppable. In such an environment, micro-vertical integration is going to be extremely powerful. So imagine if you owned a little bit of land, you had some of your own logging equipment, I don't know, maybe a Chinese forwarding trailer, and then you had a sawmill. So you could harvest your own trees that was on your land, and then you could turn that into lumber. And let's just say, hypothetically, we've never seen this sort of thing before, clearly, but hypothetically, a 2x4 costs $10. Well, yeah, you could definitely make a living off of that. That could be a viable run for sure. So I think we're going to start seeing that become more and more viable from more than just like a hobby basis. And what's so exciting about this is I think we really have the potential for the emergence of a true small-scale forest economy. So let me explain what I mean using this these mill closures as a hypothetical. Now, to be clear, I really don't know the specifics about their markets and who they're buying from, who they're selling to. So I'm just spitballing here. This is entirely hypothetical. And if you do live around there, feel free to give your explanation in the comments. I'd love to hear it. I think people would find that valuable. But anyway, a lot of times these larger mills, they're only buying from larger landowners. They don't really like buying from the small guys like you and me because it's just too much of a hassle. For a few truckloads, they don't want to deal with all the paperwork, all the contracts, etc. It's too much. So they're only going to buy from the big guys. So in aggregate, the market for wood has decreased. But you and I, we never had this market to begin with, right? And so all that happened to the macro environment is that the production of 2x4s decreased. So there's less 2x4s in the market. Now, importantly, something about the nature of lumber and timber, you could say that this isn't true because more efficient mills are just going to pick up the slack. But the thing is, the less mills there are, the higher the transportation costs are, right? So overall, it's pretty much unavoidable that the costs of lumber are going to be rising, assuming mill closures. But of course, the actual market for our wood was unaffected because these guys weren't buying it anyway. So all that happened to our wood is it has the potential to create more valuable lumber. And so what's actually happening is it's incentivizing more small-scale actors to invest in their own businesses and their own equipment. And assuming even some of these guys had enough scale to be able to buy logs from other people, the market for our wood actually expands. And while that's paradoxical, right, mill closures creating more of a market, it's entirely plausible. It really is. And this hasn't happened yet, so it's entirely hypothetical, but I've seen signs of this maybe happening. I bought my logging equipment specifically for my land. And just in the process of moving it back and forth, because it's like 10 miles away from my camp, so at the beginning and the end of the season I'll move it. Like people have stopped their cars and asked, like, "Hey, do you want to cut my land? I have land to cut." And it's kind of struck me. It's like, man, like maybe I should have bought a little larger, because like I could have actually done this. Like I should have bought a little larger trailer and like a little larger tractor so I could actually do this on a commercial scale, and that might be fun. And yeah, like the market's there. The market's already there. It's just maybe the incentive and viability aspect hasn't really sunken in yet. I don't know, but there's something to that. And I know my generation, and there's a lot more people who would think it would be fun to work at a very small, mostly outdoor sawmill operation than working in a large industrial mill. And actually, when I did my harvest, I interviewed my friend. He had never done anything in forestry, so I had him come up and help me. And I had an interview, and it kind of ended up being like a podcast type discussion. It's a bit long. I have it in chapters, so you can go and check out the bit directly about the labor shortage. And I asked him if he would do this full time. And he kind of froze, and he was like, well, no, like I don't want to do that. And I especially wouldn't do it in a large machine. But then I was like, but if you could, work with a chainsaw seasonally. And he immediately changed his attitude, and he's like, oh yeah, no question. So there's a lot of people who would be interested in something on a bit more smaller scale who are completely turned off by the larger scale aspects of forestry. So I really do think there's a lot of potential here. So I want to be clear about this. I don't think the population decline is going to be particularly comfortable. I think, quite frankly, there's a lot to be worried about, especially given how large scale and dependent on infinite growth our infrastructure is. And importantly, we don't really know what will happen. We don't have a good model for this. This has never happened before, except, in extreme circumstances like the bubonic plague. And that's worrying. There's a lot of unknowns, and there will be a lot of pain. And even though we in the forest economy are going to be the first to feel the effects of this, I have faith that we're going to make it out just fine, and even to a better, more robust place, including the big industrial guys. I did a video a while back about economies of scale, and I talked about how economies and diseconomies of scale interact in the forest industry. And all this really is a steepening of the diseconomy curve. So the larger an operation, the higher the costs are going to be, because the more dependent on labor it becomes. So yeah, this is going to be a transitionary period for sure, but I have faith. So that's all for now. Hopefully not too much of a buzzkill. I don't mean it to be. I just like to be realistic about these things, and it is an issue that we are dealing with, and I think it's fascinating. So just to give a channel update, this is actually going to be my last video from Mexico. I will be returning to the United States and to my land fairly shortly. It might be a few weeks before I post a video, because I got to do the whole motorcycle trip thing, and my motorcycle's getting up there in miles, so there's a high possibility that something could break down on the way. So I don't know exactly how long it'll take me to get back, and I might visit my family for a while and so forth. But when I do get back, I have a very busy summer in store. I have a lot of projects, another harvest, and I'm going to start doing more videos about the nitty-gritty of forest management, get back more into that, maybe lean away from some of these more philosophical type videos, economic type videos, and hopefully be posting a lot more too, because it will be a lot easier for me to post once I get back there. And of course, in the meantime, if you want to learn more about forest management, but you don't want to wait for me to get back to make all my videos, you can start learning today by going and grabbing my free ebook, How to Read Your Forest. And that is basically a primer and introductory text on forestry and small-scale forest management, so you can learn kind of some of the nuances of forest management, what it means to manage a forest, and How to Turn Your Land into a Productive Asset. So I'm going to leave a link in the description and the pinned comment below, and you can go and check that out and get your copy. All right, guys, that's all. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you later.